On Sunday, while his own vice president sat in a Swiss luxury resort telling Iranian officials the two countries could turn over a new leaf, President Trump posted from Camp David that Iran won't even make it back to their country if they don't make a deal, and that the U.S. would hit Iran very hard again. Just like we did last week, only harder. The talks recessed within the hour. Iran's lead negotiator threatened a response in a different manner. Meanwhile, in Washington, a 67-year-old Olympic canoeist was arrested for touching a piece of peeling pool liner after the president accused unnamed vandals of pouring corrosive chemicals into the Lincoln Memorial reflecting pool, a claim he has provided no evidence for. An explosion tore through the same gas export terminal that had just begun restarting operations because the Iran deal was supposed to have eased the Strait of Hormuz crisis that shut it down in the first place. 3 stories. Let's take them one at a time. Because what happened there yesterday is one of the clearest single demonstrations all month of an administration working against itself in real time. J.D. Vance arrived at the Bergenstock Resort near Lake Lucerne on Sunday to lead a quadrilateral negotiating session with Iran, Pakistan, and Qatar. The follow-on talks meant to build out the technical details of the MOU signed at Versailles 2 weeks ago. Vance opened with genuinely ambitious language. The opening of the Strait of Hormuz, the ending of the Iranian nuclear program, all of these things have been accomplished, he told reporters. Can we turn over a new leaf? Can we change relations in the Middle East permanently? Pakistan's prime minister said he hoped the talks would produce a wonderful paper that will promote peace, progress, and prosperity around the globe. It was, by every available account, an optimistic and carefully choreographed start to a high-stakes diplomatic session. Then Trump, speaking to Fox News from Camp David and posting separately to Truth Social, said he had warned Iranian officials they won't even make it back to their country if they don't make a deal. Iran must immediately stop their highly paid proxies in Lebanon from causing trouble. If they don't, we'll hit Iran very hard again, just like we did last week, only harder. Iran's lead negotiator, Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, the man sitting at the actual negotiating table that Trump's own vice president was running, posted on X, they would do better to be careful about their statements. Our armed forces are prepared to respond to them in a different manner. They may keep talking, it is we who act. Iranian state media reported the talks had entered a difficult phase and recessed following the publication of an insulting message by the U.S. president. The Iranian delegation left the negotiating site to meet separately with Qatari mediators. CNN reported that Iran's delegation did not appear in any photos alongside Vance that day, which Al Jazeera's correspondent on the ground described as a visible indicator of how tense things are. This is not a minor communications mismatch. The Vice President of the United States, physically present at the table, was trying to build trust language, turn over a new leaf, change relations in the Middle East permanently toward the exact same government that the president, from 6 time zones away, was simultaneously threatening with annihilation if they didn't comply fast enough. CNN's own framing of the episode is worth repeating directly. His undiplomatic threat Sunday to resume blowing up Iran landed just after Vice President J.D. Vance said Trump had sent him on a diplomatic mission. Sent him on a diplomatic mission and then publicly undercut that mission within hours. From a presidential retreat in Maryland, over Fox News and a phone. The proximate trigger for all of this was Lebanon, again. Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps declared Saturday it was closing the Strait of Hormuz a second time, directly citing continued Israeli attacks in southern Lebanon, which killed at least 20 people Saturday, according to Lebanese civil defense, hours after a ceasefire had supposedly taken effect. CENTCOM disputed the closure claim, saying American forces continued to oversee the waterway and that oil traffic kept flowing regardless of what Iran said publicly. An advisor to Iran's supreme leader posted that the U.S. had failed to implement the very first clause of its own 14-point agreement, the one requiring a ceasefire on all fronts, including in Lebanon. So here's where things actually stand, in plain terms, 14 days after the Versailles signing. Israel has killed dozens of people in Lebanon on at least 2 separate days since the deal was signed. Iran has twice declared the strait closed in direct response. The President of the United States has twice publicly threatened to resume bombing Iran, including once during his own vice president's active negotiating session. And the talks did not collapse entirely. By Sunday night, a senior U.S. diplomat said discussions on deconfliction mechanisms were continuing and could run through the night. The deal is, somehow, simultaneously falling apart and continuing. On the same day, in the same hotel. That is not stability. That is a process being held together purely by the exhaustion of everyone involved with the alternative. Now, the reflecting pool, because what happened this weekend moved well past the algae story I covered Saturday, into something that deserves to be called out specifically as it is. I told you Saturday that the $14 million pool renovation, repainted American flag blue on Trump's personal color choice, had turned bright green with algae and developed a visible tear in its new sealant. Here's what happened next. A Maryland man and 3-time Olympic canoeist named David Hearn was arrested near the pool after finishing a 52-mile bike ride and stopping to look at the visible damage everyone in Washington had been photographing for days. Hearn says he reached into the water to touch a piece of the coating that was already partially detached, to see what it felt like. "I didn't remove, tear, rip, break, or destroy any of it," he told NBC News. "The condition of the reflecting pool was the same after I stepped away from the water as it was before I got there," Hearn says. The National Guard member who arrested and handcuffed him could not tell him which specific law he was being charged under. He was detained for 5 hours and charged with a misdemeanor count of destruction of government property. That same weekend, President Trump posted to Truth Social, without evidence, that the United States Park Police have arrested multiple individuals for vandalizing our nation's magnificent reflecting pool, describing the alleged damage as suspects taking some form of knife or blade and cutting a 250-foot-long gash into the beautiful facade, and that they had additionally poured corrosive and destructive chemicals into the water. He called it a true affront to both Presidents George Washington and Abraham Lincoln and warned of years in jail. An administration official separately confirmed 5 arrests and 5 citations over the weekend. The National Park Service did not respond to multiple media requests for comment or evidence. As of this recording, no outlet covering this story, NPR, CBS, ABC, NBC, Fox, or The Hill, has been able to independently confirm a single one of the specific claims in Trump's post. Not the knife, not the 250-foot gash, not the corrosive chemicals. And then there's the detail that moves this from farce into something genuinely concerning. Trump separately referenced what he described as an etching of the numbers 8647 in the grass near the pool, a phrase he and his allies have previously interpreted as a coded threat against the 47th president, meaning himself. He connected this directly to the pool's algae and peeling sealant in the same post, writing that no different than the chemicals that were used on the National Mall. They used something similar in the reflecting pool to try to destroy and demean our beautiful work, treating ordinary lawn markings, foreseeable algae growth, and a structurally predictable sealant failure as 3 connected acts of a single, coordinated campaign against him personally. Every materials scientist and water treatment specialist quoted across this story this weekend, independently, before any vandalism claim was made, described the algae and the sealant problems as standard, foreseeable consequences of choosing a darker coating for a shallow, sun-exposed outdoor pool, then refilling it, without adequately accounting for the heat absorption and bacterial growth that darker surfaces predictably produce. None of that requires a saboteur. It requires only ordinary physics and a no-bid contract that, per multiple reports, ran $4 million over its own revised estimate. What turned a foreseeable engineering outcome into a story about years in jail and coded numerological threats was a presidential social media account, operating with 0 supporting evidence, escalating in real time over a single weekend, while a man who has competed in 3 Olympics sat in a park police holding cell for touching a loose piece of plastic. And finally, Qatar, because this story connects directly back to the first one. in a way that should worry anyone tracking how fragile the entire regional de-escalation actually is. On Sunday night, an explosion tore through the Barzan gas supply facility at Qatar's Ras Laffan industrial city, home to the world's largest liquefied natural gas export complex, responsible for roughly 1/5 of global LNG supply. Qatar's Interior Ministry confirmed 54 people injured and 18 still missing as search and rescue teams worked through the wreckage. Qatar Energy initially described it as an operational incident, and the ministry later attributed it to a technical malfunction during startup operations, saying there was no hazardous leak posing a danger to the public. Here's the context that every outlet covering this explosion flagged, and that deserves to be the actual headline. The Ras Laffan complex had already sustained significant damage from Iranian missile and drone attacks back in March during the active war. Qatar had subsequently scaled back its own gas production, specifically because Iran's blockade and mining of the Strait of Hormuz made it impossible to reliably ship product out to international customers. As negotiations progressed and pressure on the strait began easing, the exact de-escalation the Iran deal was supposed to deliver, Qatar's engineers began the technical process of restarting the facility. Sunday night's explosion happened during that very restart attempt. Read that sequence again. The facility gets bombed during the war. It shuts down because the war makes export logistically impossible. The peace process supposedly eases the blockade. Engineers begin restarting equipment that has been offline and under stress since the original attack. And during that restart, the literal first attempt to return to normal operations after 4 months of war-related disruption, something goes wrong, badly enough to injure 54 people and leave 18 unaccounted for. And there's no evidence pointing to anything but mechanical failure during a high-risk restart procedure. But that's exactly the point worth sitting with. Infrastructure that absorbed real combat damage doesn't simply snap back to normal the moment a diplomat signs a memorandum. Equipment that sat stressed and partially offline for months carries elevated failure risk precisely when operators try to bring it back online. And that risk doesn't show up in a press release about a signed deal. It shows up later, during the unglamorous, unphotographed restart process, in the form of 18 missing workers at one of the most important energy facilities on the planet. The deal's signature created the political conditions for this restart to happen. It did not and could not guarantee that the physical infrastructure underneath the diplomacy would cooperate. 3 stories from one weekend. A president whose own threats derailed his vice president's diplomatic mission within hours, over a war that keeps reopening and reclosing the same strategic waterway, depending on what's happening in Lebanon that day. A water treatment failure turned, with zero evidence, into an accusation of sabotage and a coded numerological threat, landing a 67-year-old Olympic athlete in a holding cell for touching a piece of plastic. And a war-damaged gas facility's first restart attempt, producing an explosion that injured dozens, precisely because 4 months of accumulated stress on degraded infrastructure doesn't disappear the moment a ceremony declares the crisis over. In every case this weekend, something that was supposed to be settled, the war, the pool, the energy supply, turned out to still be carrying damage that a signature or a press release couldn't actually repair. The paperwork keeps getting ahead of the physical reality underneath it. That gap is, once again, the only story that matters.